Hi everybody, here's our ruby-throated hummingbird family life presentation. Today we will be telling you about mates and advantages, breeding requirements and brood, and parenting styles.
All right, so mates and advantages. The males of ruby-throated hummingbirds are competing for the female's attention. So some differences they have is males have shorter and pointier wings. They use this to fight with other males over the female. They have colored gorgets. So that is that ruby colored feathers that they have around the chin area that is also to attract their mates, and then they use chattering noises to attract mates as well. So because of those smaller wings, male hummingbirds have some other challenges that go with that. So because those wings are smaller and they have obstacles to get over, like the Gulf of Mexico, and they have a long way to travel because they are migratory birds. Females have a better composition when they arrive at the breeding grounds because their wings are more energy efficient than the pointier, smaller wings that the males have. And therefore, males also have a higher metabolism. So we're looking at females having more like fat storages as well. About the breeding grounds, it is important for the males to be on time specifically because articles that I read stated that the males will usually arrive at the breeding grounds before the females do, and if they arrive late, they will automatically miss out on some breeding opportunities because the females will already have chosen some mates. Next slide, please. So some literature review, I have 2 pages for this. One of the articles, West and Butler here, this was a book that was more generally about hummingbirds, not really specific to any species. So the answers are not always going to be super specific to the ruby-throated hummingbird, but more of a general overview. But West was a professor of zoo physiology and is a bird researcher, so there is some decent credibility there. Nemeth and Moore, their article was published on behalf of the Association of Field Ornithologists, and it was a 10-year study to understand the migration ecology of these specific hummingbirds, among other things listed here. Next slide, please. So these 2 are some older articles. Mulville, they use data from multiple sites when they were collecting these birds. Mist nests were used to capture the birds that they were looking at, and the article was about sex ratios, differential migration, and different mortality between sexes. Mobile was the ornithologist of the National Aviary. That's some credibility for you there. And then the second article on this page studied the annual molts of those ruby-throated hummingbirds along with another kind of hummingbird. So that's specifically looking at shedding of the feathers and looking at those gorgets in different colors that the birds will turn throughout the year. Unlike the other articles, they did not state if the hummingbirds were captured during the study. It wasn't very particular about how the data was collected, so that was a little bit unfortunate to not exactly know about that. But the author of this article does have his PhD of biology. Next slide, please.
We also did some research on breeding requirements and brood information. The breeding season is determined by the males and takes place from March through July. The peak breeding season occurs around mid-May though, and this is due to the optimal weather and food abundance during this time. The span of the season allows the females the ability to re-nest, so they can have up to 3 broods per season. This allows them the opportunity to re-nest should something happen to their first nest and the eggs are no longer viable, or they just have the ability to produce more offspring in that season. The brood size of the female is typically 2 pea-sized eggs, The reason why it's 2 eggs specifically is because 1 egg isn't necessarily reproductively successful, as if something were to happen to the 1 egg, the female will have spent all of her time and energy in laying and incubating the egg for no offspring. However, 3 eggs require too much energy for the female hummingbird. It would be really hard for her to feed 3 young and herself. Incubation period for the hummingbirds lasts for about 2 weeks, where the female is very attentive to her eggs and her young, while the male has no part in this. She'll only leave the nest for short periods of time, and these periods vary depending on the weather. If it's nicer weather out, she'll leave the nest for a little bit longer periods of time, but still not for very long. However, if the weather is cold or rainy, she will likely not leave the nest for that period of time. Next slide, please. Some of the literature I found was in the form of studies. The first study I looked at was from the University of Michigan. They utilized their biological station, so they had all the resources necessary to complete the study. The main purpose of this was to observe interactions between hummingbirds in the presence of more or less food sources. However, the information that I used from this article had to do with males choosing a breeding territory that the females would later utilize for food. Two possible issues with this article were that it was student-led research. However, they did have a faculty advisor, Dr. David Ewert, who had a PhD and had a focus on migratory birds in the Great Lakes area, such as this hummingbird. There was a little less focus on the female hummingbirds and a bit more on the males, but overall it provided that bit of information. They did use feeders rather than relying on natural food sources, though. The second article I found was from the Journal of Ornithology. However, it's a bit dated. It's from 1948, and it was written as observations in the first person, kind of like a journal entry instead of a scientific article. I was unable to obtain any information about the author, probably due to the date of the article, but it did provide decent information on how the females are able to double and triple brood, as well as some incubation information. Next slide, please. I also found another observational study. I pulled out the information that details incubation and the time that the female spends outside of the nest. However, the study was concerned with the direction that the female sits in the nest, and they determined that during incubation, the female tends to sit with its head facing leaf surfaces. However, the study did not provide any reason as to why this might be. The author was an ornithologist at the Smithsonian Institution, so it seems like it would be a reliable study. The other 2 sources I had were in the form of fact sheets that kind of filled in any other information that I needed. The first one came from Cornell, their lab of ornithology that was created over 100 years ago. This was completely all fact-based. There were no mentions of experiments or observational studies recorded. The other fact sheet I found came from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum. This was their Journey North project, which focused on several different species of birds and their behaviors. I focused more on their picture journal of this specific hummingbird from the time period that the egg was laid to when the young left the nest. There was no mention of any variables being changed, so it was not an experiment that was carried out, but just an observation. Next slide.
I researched parenting styles. We found out that mothers do all of the parenting and fathers do not. The mother will go and find an appropriate nesting spot and build her nest. She will then lay 1 to 3 eggs. As Abby said before, the ideal number is 2. And she will incubate those eggs anywhere from 10 to 13 days. So the average is about 2 weeks. Cold weather can affect this because it can cause delays in the incubation period, and rainy weather can also affect this. The mother will provide for the babies after hatching for about 7 to 22 days. All of this depends on how many offspring she has and the weather. After the children are grown and can provide for themselves, she will teach them how to live and where to gather food for about 3 to 4 days, and then she will chase them off so they can live on their own. So the total number is about 30 to 40 days, depending on how many offspring and what the weather is like. So I researched 2 articles. These are both observational articles. Both of them are relatively outdated. One is from 1936 and the other is from 1928, so it was hard to find information on their authors. One was from the Wilson Ornithological Society, and this was all observational data. He did not reference other studies, but only recorded observations from one nest that he was watching. In the Hinman observations, this was from the American Ornithological Society. He did reference other studies, but also only discussed findings from one of his nests and did not observe other nests or discuss future research that was done in the following years. Some of our remaining questions were if mothering females were to interact with each other, what that would look like. To do this, you could find 2 nests that were in close proximity. We don't know if nests are in close proximity and if the mothers would interact with each other. Based on that question, also is where the mother chooses to nest. Is it close to the breeding grounds or is it far away? In the research that was done, we found that it's usually in a heavily wooded area near a water source, but is that comparative to where the breeding grounds are?
We talked about the males having less body fat because of the smaller wings, but we were wondering what are the advantages or disadvantages in the different sexes about having more body fat. And this could be comparing males with males and females with females, how that helps to attract mates, or just the advantages of having higher body fats. You could also observe if the likelihood of breeding increases with a higher body fat. Another question we had, kind of looking at the feathers here, do females prefer to mate with older or younger male hummingbirds? In some of the research, it stated that males who are older will get their gorgets before the younger ones will, or they'll be more brightly colored. So we could observe breeding grounds and take notes of the colors of the male's gorgets and whether they're being chosen more or less to be mates.
One question that remained from breeding requirements was if females would still breed in non-optimal conditions. So given that the male and the female are both present in the breeding territory, will they still mate if the conditions aren't right? So we could observe how breeding events are impacted by various temperatures and possibly the amount of food that is located in the environment that they're breeding. And that was our information for the family life of the red-throated hummingbird. So thank you for listening to our presentation.